By now, we all know that Natlan has this quirky thing about all the Pyro Archons being human, but going through the quest and reading item descriptions was all Shibbolunky this, Shibbolunky that, with a touch of Scarlet-Eyed Youth and a pinch of Coconina. And given how limited their times as Archons are, not only because of wars with the Abyss, but also the bargain with Renova, you'd think the position of Pyro Archon would be like one for all, with a new bearer of the Gnosis every couple of years. But we don't even know who the Pyro Archon was prior to Maoika, for either time she was Archon. Real quick, before we get into the rest of the video, I just want to point out that I started working on this on the 20th of March in anticipation of some major lore drops for the Ancient Sacred Mountain, but it got to the point where I'd be releasing the video the day before 5.5 dropped, and I decided to put it off until I had the chance to see what, if anything, the new region might change about the video. If I was a better content creator, I'd make necessary changes to the video and interject new information when it becomes relevant throughout the video, but I'm not. So I'm just gonna tack on any new observations to the end. We good? Let's get going then. Thankfully, after completing the 4.3 Archon quest, we obtained the item Obsidian Ancient Name that finally gave us some light on the previous Archons. Let's look at what it has to say. Hear the hatred that festered in the heart of the unrivaled warrior 1,000 years ago. Alright, 1,000 years ago. What do we got next? Coconina makes a return with 1,000-year-old despair. Okay, weird. What about Ndenge and his 1,000-year madness? We're still not getting anywhere. Okay? Shibbolunky again. Let's see what it says about him. Perceive his 1,000-year-old lie. Wait, we know for a fact that the Archon War was 2,000 years ago, and Shibbolunky was Natlan's first Archon, but his lie is 1,000 years old? So what, does that mean that Natlan didn't have an Archon until 1,000 years after the war that was fought to determine who the Archons would be? Or maybe, since we don't have any history for Natlan prior to 1,000 years ago, Natlan didn't exist until 1,000 years ago. Well, not exactly, but we are getting somewhere. I mean, if it didn't exist until 1,000 years ago, where did Shibbolunky and the other tribes in Natlan come from? Before we move on to answering those questions, allow me to ask you all a question. How long ago was prehistory? 10,000 years ago? 5,000? What if I told you the answer was, it depends. If we're talking about the Eastern Mediterranean, we're looking at about 5,500 years ago. Northern Africa and Southern Europe, about 4,500 years ago. Europe and China, between that and 3,000 years ago. Most of Africa and the American continents, for the ones that developed writing systems prior to colonization, it's just been a bit over 2,000 years. This is because when we refer to prehistory, we're referring to the history of humans prior to the development of recorded history, aka some kind of writing. You ever wondered why we believe humans originated from around Mesopotamia? Well, it's because that's the earliest form of writing we've discovered. What does that have to do with our origins? Kind of everything. Why do you think Western Europe, China, sub-Mediterranean Africa, and the American continents would develop writing so much later than the Eastern Mediterranean? Well, if that's where all life started, it takes some time to get from there to those other places. Writing only develops from settled civilizations. Nomadic tribes had their hands full just staying alive while moving from place to place. So pretty much across the board, the further a group of people were from Mesopotamia, the longer it took for them to settle into one place and have the opportunity to develop the tools and traits we see in every ancient civilization. And now I know that there are some of you screaming, what does any of this have to do with Natlan? And there are some of you that have already clicked off the video because I spent too much time talking about the real world, and fair. But the answer to that question is, once again, kind of everything. Think back. Where is recorded history the oldest? the Eastern Mediterranean. And the region with the only recorded history prior to the Archon War is Sumeru, which is based on that region of the world. Liyue, Mondstadt, Fontaine, and Inazuma, would you look at that? The Archon War is pretty much where our knowledge of history begins. And Natlan, which is based on Africa and the American continent's history, begins roughly 1,000 years after that, which, in the real world, reflects when recorded history began for those civilizations, which would mean that Natlan, prior to Xbalanque, is basically lost to time. We see further evidence of this with the manga, where we learn about Murata, who isn't written about anywhere in game. Remind me again when this chapter of the manga takes place? Oh, over 1,000 years ago. And how do we learn about Murata? From Vanessa through word of mouth. Kind of like how prehistoric legends had to be passed down through folktales because the means to record them had not been developed yet. And my read on this is that would have made Murata the Pyro Archon before Xbalanque. If that's the case, it would mean Natlan was originally ruled by a god, Murata, who was overthrown or succeeded by Xbalanque. That said, why are Xbalanque and every Archon after him written as 1,000 years ago? Well, once again, it all comes back to writing. During the Masters of the Nightwind Tribal Chronicles, we learn how they record their history through scrolls with images depicting events, which also falls in line with most of the writing systems used by the civilizations Natlan represents. This form of writing functions as a depiction of events that took place, not when they took place. Given that Natlan only started recording their history 1,000 years ago, the one thing we know for certain is that these records were made sometime after, and that's why practically all the lore tucked away throughout Natlan is riddled with the word ancient. It's an acknowledgement that we know this happened and that it was a long time ago, but have no idea when. This is reflected again during the Masters of the Nightwind Chronicle, because even the people of the tribe responsible for recording their history debate that history and struggle to determine what is myth and what isn't. To give a Eurocentric example, we can look at the legends of King Arthur. It's kind of up in the air whether or not he even existed, and most historians and linguists would agree he didn't, but there have been parallels made to folk legends that were later preserved in writing, and it's generally accepted that Arthurian legend is born from an amalgamation of folktales about various European leaders that were lost to history. So, you can imagine, if we can't fully piece together things that occurred after recorded history began, because writing emerged before feudalism in Europe, it must be insanely difficult to do for prehistoric civilizations and those that use pictographic writing systems, like Natlan scrolls. Some of those in my US audience may be thinking back to the segment in their history classes concerning the native peoples in their states and just realizing, so that's why we focus so heavily on their history post-colonization. Make no mistake, colonization definitely plays a role in why we teach so little about Native American history pre-colonization, but the largest reason it's so limited is because what we know is limited, especially for North American tribes because they were largely nomadic and thus hadn't developed writing until colonization. If all these issues make it this difficult to nail down what their histories are, we're pretty much stuck with just what we know post-colonization when teaching it in K through 12. So can you see why I haven't done Natlan theories? Don't get me wrong, it's pretty freaking cool that Hoyo incorporated this nuance of history into the game, but it makes it really difficult to make lore theories when you don't even know if a piece of lore is referring to Xbalanque or if the name is just being used to fill in for some generic lost-to-time ruler that's just been attributed to Xbalanque, like how so many legends about Western European rulers were attributed to King Arthur. I'm no anthropologist, I'm an English teacher with a focus on linguistics. I don't do prehistory, but I can tell you one thing for sure, if I were, I'd probably have better things to do with that expertise than put together the history of a fictional group of people in a gacha game. Natlan is just too hard to do lore theories on, and I'd wager to guess that probably has something to do with why Ashikai has generally been avoiding it and why Aster quit. I don't know for sure because I started using my second channel to browse YouTube to avoid watching Genshin content, but it's what I would do if I were them, considering it's what I have done since the start of 5.0. But speaking of Ashikai, I do have something thanks to her 3.8 Fontaine prediction from back when. I think that there may be a bigger reason why Natlan's recorded history begins 1,000 years ago, and it all goes back to the 4.8 summer event. For those of you that don't know, Ashikai predicted that all Fontainians were actually Oceanids, because during the 3.8 event, it was revealed that all the characters in that event were Oceanids. Well, during the 4.8 event, we're taken to a storybook land separate from Teyvat that was created by the Hexen Circle based on the principles that govern Teyvat. Now, wouldn't it be something if Xbalanque separated Natlan from the rest of Teyvat's ley lines, essentially separating it from Teyvat? Oh, wait, he did. And wouldn't it be something if there were 6 tribes all corresponding to a specific element, just like how Teyvat, which is separate from Natlan, is split into 6 nations that correspond to a specific element? Children of Echoes and Liyue for Geo, Scions of the Canopy and Sumeru for Dendro, People of the Springs and Fontaine for Hydro, Masters of the Nightwind and Sensnaya for Cryo, Flower Feather and Mondstadt for Animo, and the Collective of Plenty and Inazuma for Electro, with neither Teyvat or Natlan having a Pyro region. That's a rather odd coincidence, don't you think? Not only that, but each tribe has a Wyab acting as what is essentially its god, just like how the nations of Teyvat each have an Archon. Just like with the 4.8 summer event, where we got a new world separate from Teyvat that was based on Teyvat, Natlan is a region separate from Teyvat that seems to be based on Teyvat. It even has its own floating city. How about that? Now, I can't end the video without pointing out that my chess theory has, once again, been proven correct. Piero is only playing as black, and we have direct evidence of this thanks to the same item that finally gave me the push I needed to get to this video, the Obsidian Ancient Name. Under Xbalanque's section in the description of the item, it states that he doomed Natlan to an endgame without any solution. That's really interesting because in my last chess video I said this, meaning Kasparov took a loss on a game that would have resulted in no winner. If you need a rundown of the chess theory, I've got a few videos on it, and so does every other lore tuber, so take your pick and get yourself caught up before coming back. For everyone else, in Game 4, which is where everyone still believes we are, Kasparov and Deep Blue agree to a draw, which is kind of odd considering the captain gave up and the Abyss was defeated, making it a pretty clear-cut defeat. But if Piero is only playing as black, for Natlan, we would move to Game 2 in the rematch between Deep Blue and Kasparov. The general theory would now be on Game 3, which we just pointed out was a draw, but Piero absolutely won in Fontaine. The prophecy still happened. They prevented the destruction of the House of the Hearth, so they could go through with Project Stusha. They got the Gnosis, and Arlecchino beat the Traveler so badly, Aether was lucky to be wearing the brown pants. You know what would happen if Piero only plays as black? Would you look at that? The only loss Deep Blue ever had is white. And now we have Natlan in the next game with Piero playing as black. An undoubtable win for Deep Blue in an unwinnable endgame, which is exactly what is pointed out to us directly by the Obsidian Ancient Name. Look y'all, I don't think I'm that great at lore theories. My creative process is, that seems like a fun video, but can those of y'all that are good at it give up on the general chess theory yet? I'd really like to see what people who are way better at this than me could do if they acknowledged what's been made abundantly clear at this point. Piero only plays as black. The game after game approach is holding y'all back. As far as new information, the story quest aligns with my gripes about Xbalanque being the beginning of everything we know. Even in a quest about the Dragonborn, the race that controlled Natlan before humans, everything we learn about is stuff that happened while Xbalanque was fighting against them, aside from a bit of lore establishing Nibelung's lore with how he arrived and returned to Teyvat, and establishing that Natlan was once nothing but primordial fire, similar to how, at least, Fontaine was nothing but primordial sea. You'd assume Xbalanque couldn't have led the tribes if the land was just fire, so when Natlan became inhabitable is kind of lost to time. Another thing important to note with the Ancient Sacred Mountain was the goal to reclaim the throne/authority from Natlan. This supports my idea that Natlan is separate from the rest of Teyvat, because otherwise the throne would have to be reclaimed from Celestia, like it was in Fontaine. And, in fact, in Natlan's own floating city, we have the Throne of Primal Fire, which I completely forgot about until I went to get my Traveler C6 after maxing my Collective of Plenty rep. On the face of things, Natlan is Teyvat is more absurd than Fontaine used to be Celestia, but the fact that the tribes mirror the Six Nations within Teyvat and their own floating city has a throne for the dragon's authority alone makes it pretty open and shut as far as I'm concerned. It also explains why the devastation 500 years ago was particularly bad in Natlan, and why the war with the Abyss has been ongoing since. Teyvat had intervention from Celestia and Natlan didn't, because it wasn't under Celestia's control. Also, just wanted to throw this out there, but another interesting bit of Natlan being based on Teyvat is that we have these structures scattered across that share the same function as celestial nails for repelling the Abyss. Bifron in Varesa's story quest gave us some more concrete information, and go figure he's from Sumeru instead of Natlan. For one, it's confirmed that Natlan didn't participate in the Archon War. Given what we learn in the Ancient Sacred Mountain quest, I think it's reasonable to assume Natlan escaped conquest from the Heavenly Principles, hence why, ironically, the Nation of War would be exempt from the Archon War. However, it is tough to pin down when exactly Bifron came from Sumeru to Natlan. We know he started his cult during the Archon War, but they seemingly stayed underground long after the Archon War ended, considering he was unaware that it had ended. It also seems as though the red and green mushrooms were a new phenomena, but it's unclear how long it took for him to gather enough strength to make more clones of himself. The fact that he confused Natlan's war with the Abyss to the Archon War points to it either happening during the destruction of Conria or upon Mavuika's return. It seems unlikely that he and the follower that brought him wouldn't have noticed the war had ended unless some catastrophe was going on at the time, so my guess is that it happened during the Cataclysm. The whole quest is kind of an acid trip though, and the fact that it hinges on a Sumeru scholar knowing it was a mushroom god and deciding to cryptically tell them, "Don't let the green ones grow," leans toward it being more recent, and the scholar being the follower that brought them and giving those instructions, so at least someone would eventually be exposed to his influence. That said, I've been wondering what all this means for the retcon in Sumeru. Like, even if Natlan is part of Teyvat, the fact that its ley lines were separated from it should mean that Natlan was exempt when Nahida and Wanda did that Control H and reset everything. So you'd think, either way, Bifron, Mavuika, and maybe even Citlali would remember Rukkhadevata, right? Citlali wouldn't have been around at the time, but she'd definitely have lived long enough to hear someone refer to the greater and lesser lords, right? Overall, Natlan has been pretty cagey about speaking of the other Archons, and that, at the very least, gives the potential for some pretty massive reveals down the road. What do y'all think? Have I lost it? I guess I should say, have I lost it more than I usually have? Or am I cooking something with this? Let me know. Bye.